Mexico City. The devastation caused by Tuesday's earthquake in Mexico City was far less than it might have been, and a fraction of what the city suffered in the quake of 1985. But one main reason had to do with the nature of the earthquake itself and less with the toughened building codes adopted in the last 30 years, as many people had thought. Although the new codes now rank among the world's best, their enforcement is deeply flawed and uneven, according to interviews with scholars, officials and building inspectors. Building inspections have essentially been outsourced to a network of private engineers who are hired and paid for by the developers, creating conflicts of interest that can undermine even the best standards. Tighter building codes, better construction materials and a robust public awareness surely played a role in limiting the carnage this time around. Fewer than 300 people died and about 40 buildings collapsed, while nearly 4,000 buildings were declared severely damaged and are likely to be uninhabitable, officials have said. But what spared this metropolitan area of 21 million was, at least in part, luck. The 1985 earthquake was 30 times more powerful than the one on Tuesday. It toppled apartment and office towers, killing more than 10,000 people. Tuesday's earthquake, while centered closer to the capital, struck hardest at smaller, less populated buildings, taking fewer lives. They were different seismic activities, in magnitude but especially given the distance, said Dr. Eduardo Reynoso, a researcher specializing in seismic engineering at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Because this one was much closer, the shock waves were different. This quake affected shorter houses and buildings, while in 1985 the collapses were mostly high-rises because of the different waves. In a 2016 study of a random sample of 150 buildings constructed after 2004, when the new codes were adopted, Mr. Reynoso found that many failed to meet city standards. In many cases, the buildings reviewed did not even have enough necessary paperwork to conduct a full assessment. As it often goes in Mexico, it is not the law that is problematic, but rather the implementation. Whether because of a lack of political will, the corruption that seeps through the system or the dysfunction of the bureaucracy, one of the deadliest threats that the nation faces has been left unfixed. Once the dust settles, officials will be confronted once more with a choice, whether to truly enforce a public safety imperative or continue with reforms that seem to exist mostly on paper. Some developers have their preferred inspectors and they usually hire the same person for their buildings, so that inspector is active, familiar, and always has a ton of work, said Jorge Ortiz, an engineer and architect who is one of several hundred contract inspectors for the city. And sometimes if you have several projects, they aren't there as much or are not present at all phases of construction, and that's when there's carelessness. According to last year's study, of the buildings that could be fully inspected, 71% failed to meet a high threshold of compliance with the city standards, while 36% failed to meet even a lower threshold of compliance. It would appear that the regulator is not performing its duty, the study concluded. But the inspection of older buildings can also be lax, which might have been the case in the tragedy at the Enrique Rabsamen School, where 19 children and 6 adults died this past week following the collapse of one of its buildings. City code requires that certain buildings, including schools, be inspected for safety after an earthquake. After a massive earthquake hit Mexico on September 7, an inspector was dispatched to the school. The contracted inspector signed off on the structure, deeming it safe, said Claudia Scheinbaum, the local delegate in charge of the district where the school is located. They came to the school to verify the building and said it was okay, she said. There are still tens of thousands of pending requests across the city for engineers to review structural damages, so the estimate of damaged buildings is likely to grow. As in many of the recovery efforts, legions of volunteers have raised their hands to help in the building assessments. A patchwork group of engineering groups and non-governmental organizations have taken to the streets to assess the status of structures whose sagging frames pose dangers to neighboring buildings as well as passers-by. Still, it could have been worse, a message that some in the civil engineering community are hoping to send to Mexico City officials to prompt changes to the conflict-ridden system of building inspections. We are concerned if we have a huge earthquake like the one in 1985 we may have problems in buildings, said Sergio Alcocer, the vice president of the Mexican Society of Civil Engineers and the former head of structural engineering for